Mark McCormick, Director of Strategic Communications here at the ACLU of Kansas. How are you doing today?
I'm well. Can you say that 5 times fast?
I apparently can't. I couldn't say it 2 times fast.
I can't either.
Medium speed.
I can't either.
We're just connecting real quick, doing another little front. So on our trip to Wichita that we just talked a little bit last time with our Stephanie Byers interview, we also talked to Tabitha Lehman. And that was something that you arranged. I just thought I'd toss it to you to kind of introduce who she is and why you were interested in talking to her.
Well, Tabitha used to be the elections commissioner there for county government. And people may have heard of her because she did manage to get a measure passed that allowed voters in Sedgwick County to vote anywhere in the county, even outside their precinct. And it was a measure that would make voting a lot easier for Sedgwick County voters. Just an interesting person. Once we got to know her, she demonstrated an incredible depth of knowledge about elections generally, but also a sense that it would be wonderful to have more people participating civically than are now.
Yeah. Talking with her, there were a few things that were really illuminating. One of the things I thought was really interesting, and even just a heads up if someone listens to the interview, I think she corrects herself a lot of times, but she says, when she talks about the election commission, she uses we a lot. And a couple of different times has to correct herself of well, not we because I'm not there anymore. But I think just talking to her, and she talks about how this was something that spurred from childhood and getting involved with the elections at that point and stuff. What did you think of kind of her dedication and her passion for the work?
That's so interesting, Jesse, that you picked up on that. You know, when people identify themselves by their work, that's often a really good sign. Where there's not a lot of daylight between who they are and what they do, that's usually an indication of how much they care about the job and how much dedication that they have. And both of those things seem to be true about Tabitha.
Sure. And she also, it's an interesting perspective from her too. She identifies herself as a Republican in the interview, but in a number of different instances goes against the talking points that other Republicans specifically have been saying. What did you make of kind of some of her measuredness or even some of her affiliations there?
To me, that really spoke to her integrity. That to her, voters and this process came well before any kind of, and maybe that's not fair to say either. I think voters and the process come before any kind of partisanship whatsoever. In fact, she considers that office to be, or that it should be, a nonpartisan office. Mm-hmm. And so she's committed to the voters and to the process more than anything else.
Yeah. I got that sense too of in a couple of times she directly goes against her. Talks about some of her disappointments and what she's seen there. In other instances too, just in general, I was listening back just before kind of we got a chance to talk to just kind of fill my head with it again. And I know at one point she's talking about voter ID laws for voting, and it's not. I'm assuming that it's contrary to the stance the ACLU has taken. I don't know if it's necessarily how either of us believe ourselves, but she talks about how having IDs helped her in the process. But it's just interesting because I think there's a genuine desire and belief in people and systems and the election system there. But maybe it a little bit presupposes some of the issues of just getting an ID is not as accessible as that should be. I don't know what maybe some of your takeaways were of some of the sticking points where you maybe didn't agree with her or
The great thing about talking to Tabitha is unless she told you so, you'd have a hard time figuring out where she was on the political spectrum.
Right.
That's perfect. That's just perfect.
Not just with measure, but just absolute depth of knowledge too. It's one of those things where it was I guess maybe a little bit just challenging just in terms of what I've heard around some of the other things I've seen, but there's no doubt and no, I mean, there's no doubt that she knows exactly what she's talking about to a depth that I think you and
Yeah.
I'll speak for myself, that I can only dream of. I mean, she
Well,
is all in the weeds.
She had an impressive depth of knowledge. She talks about in the interview all of the preparation that she got at the University of Minnesota on these kinds of issues. It was just impressive. And what's interesting also is that we don't always give election officials credit for having that kind of about having that kind of depth of knowledge.
Right.
And it's clearly there with her.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And I think there are even points too where you can see some of the stickiness of just her knowledge and her desire to do the right thing, and then some of the political considerations, not in terms of Republican, Democrat, but just in terms of newsiness. I mean, she talks about how she was warned against putting polls in too high traffic of an area, because then you're going to get back up and that's going to become a news story. And it just was a really interesting consideration that you could tell she was doing everything she could to try to get people to participate and allow participation in the process. But then there were, I mean, some of these real world hurdles that she had to get over too, and it sounds like she did so admirably. So I want to make sure, Mark, I give you the last word. Is there anything else that you want people to be thinking of or looking out for as they listen to this?
Well, I just think that what was particularly interesting for me was her learning curve. This is clearly someone who's very bright and very prepared, got a lot of schooling on this. But in the course of doing her work, she learned to do a lot of things. She learned to accept some of the criticism from a lot of nonprofit organizations that lobby for voting rights.
Yeah.
And she learned to use them as allies to make her work better, to make her work more efficient. I thought that not only spoke well of her, but of the kind of office that she ran there in Sedgwick County once upon a time.
That's a really astute pull out. I think that was a really kind of pivotal moment in talking to her, of seeing those as not criticisms, but people all interested in making sure that things are like almost a check to the system a little bit, that she saw it.
Yeah, absolutely. That we're all challenged with making sure that we can separate ourselves from the roles that we play.
Yeah,
and that was the step that she took.
Yeah, I think she came to, exactly. I think she came to appreciate that people were invested in the process, even rather than being frustrated that they are maybe, getting involved, that being appreciative that this is something people care about because it's important. So, yeah, that was a perfect flag. So awesome. Thanks, Mark. Thanks for joining me for this.
All right. Thanks, Jess.
Yeah, thanks a lot. We're going to jump right in here, and here is our interview with Tabitha.
Prior to that, I was a stay-at-home mom with young children, so it was a very quick adjustment going from being a stay-at-home mom to then, within 2 years, being the election commissioner and working 80 to 90 hours a week, 6 months out of a year, and then even in the off years working 50 to 60 hours a week, so it was definitely quite an adjustment for my family.
What was it about elections that were so exciting for you, that put all this passion in your blood for it?
Well, as a young child, my parents were always very involved in elections, and I remember, we were encouraged to vote always. As soon as we were 18, let's get you registered and get you involved in that process. My parents worked on a lot of campaigns, protested, did a lot of different things like that I was involved in with my family. And it was just something that was always discussed and was always present in our home, was the civic responsibility of voting and how important that right is for you. And my mom was an election worker. She was actually the one that encouraged me to start working the polls. So on my very stressed out days, I would call her and say, "This is your fault." And she would remind me, "Yes, it is. And I'll take ownership of that." But it was that. And it was also just, as I became more and more involved as an election official and stepped more and more back from being political, I could see the inequities on both sides and became even more impassioned with standing up for the voters instead of a political party. I don't care which political party it is. And just feeling like there are things that, and quite frankly, if I'm just going to be honest, both political parties do that are not right. And And it just became that impassioned thing for me to make sure that in Sedgwick County, with what I was charged with, I was doing everything in my power, yes, to provide secure elections, but also to make them as accessible as possible. And one of the things that I learned while taking some classes actually in University of Minnesota to get my certificate in election administration was there's a lot of tension in election administration, and one of those tensions is between accessibility and security, and you have to find that balance of how do we make it as accessible to all eligible voters as possible, but still make it secure. And that's a constant battle, and we see that all the time. We see that certainly in the 2020 election cycle. We've seen that in legislation being passed past that point of where is that balance, and that's a difficult balance to strike, but it's certainly something I'm very passionate about.
Can you talk a little more about the inequities that you had referenced just a second ago?
Sure. Well, you see, and I will pick on both sides just because that's me. I'm going to tell you like I see it. Well, we'll see. From one instance, we have a lot of weight given to that if you're made to vote a provisional ballot, this is bad. That a provisional ballot is bad. It's a lot of stigma with that, and that seems to be a lot of rhetoric pushed. Not to be offensive, some of it from the ACLU, some of it from the Democratic Party, some of it just from candidates. But from an election administration point of view, voting a provisional ballot is protection for the voter. And it provides for the election officials to correct something if we made a mistake, if the voter made a mistake. It is a protection, not something that should be viewed as punishment or something that should be viewed as bad. If I went and voted a provisional ballot right now, I would have 100% confidence that if I had made a mistake and it's something that can be fixed, it will be counted. I also have 100% confidence that if it was a mistake on the part of an election official, that it would also be counted. That is what I think people need to hear. So that is one of the things that was very frustrating to me coming in and hearing so much, is because as election officials, we viewed it, and I will say the state election director, Brian Caskey, my entire time, and Brad Bryant before him, the election director before him, have pounded into Kansas election officials, you never, ever turn away a voter, no matter what, you offer them a provisional ballot. And so Kansas has much higher provisional ballot rates than some other states, and I believe that is part of it, because if somebody comes in and says, I'm registered to vote in Colorado, our election officials are not trained at the polling sites to say, then you can't vote here. They are trained to offer them a provisional ballot, and yes, when we get that back in our office and research it, I'm sorry, not our office, the election office gets it back. I apologize. This is ingrained, years of doing this. It's going to take me a while. But when the election office gets that back and researches it, if the law says that ballot can't count, they're not going to count it. But we don't, as election officials in the state, don't turn away a voter. And so that is something that was very frustrating to me on one side, is it was very much vilified. If we had high provisional ballot rates, if we had high rates of people being told to vote provisionally, it was something was wrong in our jurisdiction. And to me, it was we were doing something right, because we were making sure that people got to cast a ballot and then research it on the other end. So that is one side. The other side, I would say, on the Republican side, quite frankly, is the vilifying of voting by mail. That has been a big thing for me my entire time working in the election office. And I realize that is not going to be sit well with many of people of my own party. I am a Republican. I don't think that is going to sit well with them that I'm saying this, but I will say it. I don't care. That is something that we have good laws in Kansas. We require signature verification. We require government-issued photo ID. We check the signatures before the ballot's counted. If we have a mismatched signature or the signature is not there, we reach out to the voter. We are now required, the election officials in the state pushed legislation to require the election officials to notify the voter if something is wrong. And there's multiple reasons for that. One is so that we give a voter the chance to fix something that is wrong with their ballot, which, by the way, second chance voting is required by federal law, and that law brought the state of Kansas into compliance with that. But secondly, the other reason is if something has gone wrong, and let's see, I requested a ballot by mail, and my nefarious neighbor, which I don't really have nefarious neighbors, but let's just imagine that I did, intercepted it in my mailbox. I voted the ballot and returned it, signed my name and returned it. The election office says, this is not Tabitha's signature, which good luck to them because my signature changes all the time, but whatever. They if they said this is not Tabitha's signature, in times past, it would be Tabitha didn't sign this, we don't count this, and we move on. Now I'm notified that signature did not match, and I can say, whoa, I never got that ballot. Someone else voted it, and that can then immediately be sent for investigation to the sheriff and try to figure out what happened with that ballot. So it is a balance. Again, this is having these laws that protect the voters is a balance of accessibility with security. So it's still that same thing. So the vilification of ballot drop boxes, I do not understand that. There is no difference in dropping someone's ballot in a ballot drop box or putting a stamp on it and putting it in the mail. I don't understand where that concern comes from. I have not been able to wrap my mind around that one, and I have listened to the conspiracy theories, and yes, I will call them conspiracy theories. Love you Republicans, but they are conspiracy theories on this subject. I have not been able to find credible information that has convinced me this is a problem.
Do you think the voter fraud narrative is also a conspiracy theory? 3 years ago, we did a survey. We surveyed county clerks, and a high percentage of them, maybe 8 out of 10, said that voter fraud was not an issue at all, or at least not one that they were concerned about. How do you feel about that issue?
I feel like you have to dive into what your definition of fraud is. Do people make mistakes? Absolutely they do. Was their intent to defraud the system? I don't know. I don't know their heart. But in most of the cases that I came across, even with non-citizens in Sedgwick County, they were at a DMV office, and the DMV clerk said, do you want to register to vote? And they said, yes. Well, I'm sorry. If I was in a foreign country and I went to a government office to get a driver's license or an ID, and that government official offered me the right to register to vote, my first thought wouldn't be, oh, I can't do this. It would be, government said I could. So there's a definition difference, in my opinion, of was it fraudulent? Maybe, but what was the intent, and when are we going to call something fraud versus a mistake? If I run a red light because I was distracted on my phone, was that running a red light? Absolutely it was. But it wasn't like I said, ooh, red light, I'm going to gun it and go through, okay? And so I think some of that...
intent.
It is, and do I still have to pay the consequences for running the red light? Yes, I do. Okay, I'm not going to deny that. Yes, you do. But there is a difference in intent, and I think that that's where there's a disconnect from most election officials, and the screaming of voter fraud is I have not seen the intent. And, we had almost 330,000 registered voters in Sedgwick County in 2020. Now, given I was working from home most of that time because of having cancer, but through all of these years of conducting elections, I've heard anecdotal stories, and I have never been able to track them down to something hardcore happening like ballot harvesting. I've heard stories, but when I try to, it's like one person tells me the story, and then I track that down. Well, they heard it from this person, and they heard it from that person, and I never even can get to where it actually occurred from. And do I think people pick up ballots and deliver them for other people? Absolutely, yes, I do. But again, we're comparing that signature on that envelope. And so if I have someone come to my door and hand them a ballot that I voted, there's a bit of responsibility on me. And if I'm not comfortable giving that ballot to that person, then that's my responsibility. And that's more than you asked, but that's how I answer questions.
Thank you. I have to say that talking to you is very refreshing, because we're so tribal. And
yes.
We talk from one pole and another pole when most of us are kind of in the middle. So I get the sense that you're really sharing an authentic point of view that is as objective as you can possibly be.
I try. I will be very honest, and this may not sit well with you guys. That's not going to apologize. It's who I am. I am a big advocate of government-issued photo ID for voting. Now, one of the things we must do is we must provide availability of free IDs for people to vote, which Kansas has done. And I think that's the reason why our law has stood up in court. But that is something that it is not just because we need to verify who the voter is. It is also actually a protection for the voter. And when I say that, you say, what does that mean? Well, okay, so I will be honest. We had a couple of times where we had someone we had an obituary that matched our voter, and we canceled them because we thought they were dead, genuinely. Name matched, date of birth matched, everything we could go off matched. We thought they were dead.
Just
And
turned
they-
out they were in Missouri.
And they, no? Okay, sorry. You're not going to get me on these things. It's not going to work. But they show up in our office in person and say, why did I have to vote a provisional ballot? And they show us their driver's license and, oh, this person is very much alive. We made a mistake. That voter ID helped us determine that. Does that make sense? There were a lot of times in years past where you had juniors and seniors and they would come in and they would vote on the other person's record. And by having the voter ID, when you scan their driver's license to pull them up, you are making sure you're actually getting that person. There's no discrepancy. You're not giving them the wrong ballot. It's cutting down on a lot of mistakes that election officials can make. And so, and again, I will reiterate, because Kansas has a way for someone to get a free ID to vote, it is not a poll tax. So that is where that comes full circle for me, sitting back and watching and seeing the mistakes that election officials can make. To me, it's not even so much about voter fraud as it is making the process more secure for the voters from the perspective of mistakes that we humans as election officials can make.
Talk more about your particular message to people who run elections.
I think a disservice that we do, I wouldn't say just Kansas, it's nationwide, is there is a big disconnect between election officials and advocacy groups, a significant disconnect. And as election officials, we tend to view advocacy groups, and I keep saying we, I apologize, it's just ingrained, that's going to take many years before it's not a we, especially because in my heart it is still a we. But as election officials, we viewed advocacy groups almost as the enemy. They were scary. They would submit open records requests for things that might point out our mistakes, that might point out where we needed to improve. That's scary. That is scary. That's terrifying, especially when you first start out. You know, when I first started out as election commissioner, we had about 274,000 registered voters, and I had myself and 3 staff. We did not have enough employees to make sure everything was done right, sadly. And so when you don't have the resources, you don't have the staffing that you need to do your job, it is very terrifying when someone wants to shine a big light on it. One of the things actually that the process that I went through with the University of Minnesota taught me was I was sitting in this class, and one of my professors actually, and it was all online, but okay, sitting at my computer for an online class, and this professor is talking about, again, those tensions and the roles that advocacy groups play in democracy and in keeping our republic strong and robust. And it had never occurred to me that there is a valid, good reason that advocacy groups occur and are there. Whether I agree with everything they stand for or not is immaterial. It is advocacy groups play a role in keeping us honest. B, one of the things that they do is they help election officials fight for resources, because if we can't do our job right and they're shining a light on that, that can help us fight for resources, okay? But also I had never put the connection, and I was sued multiple times as an election official, did not lose a single case. I would just like to say that, and for that I credit the great work of the Sedgwick County legal department, who were the ones who gave me the advice going into any lawsuits beforehand. So they made sure I followed the law to start with, and then we were covered when we went into court. But I would not like to take the credit for that. They definitely are good people. Anyway, that aside, sorry. When you see the role of an advocacy group as you have a group of people who may not agree with a law that has been passed, they have already gone to the legislative bodies and sought a change in that law and been denied that. The only way they have left at that point is to go to the courts and challenge the law. Therefore, the election official is the point of contact for that, because we are the person, the election official, not me. Election officials as a whole are the people who are imposing that law, who are enforcing that law. So therefore, they are the person who is sued. When you take out that personal attack and realize that's not actually about you, it's about a law that an advocacy group feels is unjust, or that they feel is going to compromise the voting process, and you become less personally involved and emotionally attached to, I am being sued yet again, that allows you to see both sides of the issue and to realize it's not about you. And I'll give you case in point. So let's go back to when I was first an election official. We had Beth Clarkson, who is a statistician from WSU, who was concerned that the voting machines were rigged. She did open records requests. She did recount requests. None of them followed the law in what we could allow her to access. So we denied those. I was very much vilified in the press because I was keeping things closed. I got hate mail. I literally had my children's lives threatened by somebody. And you have, giving me the list of where my children went to school, things like that. It's very scary. And I was literally following the law. I knew the machines were not rigged. I was 100% confident in that. But we cannot have an election system where I stand up and I say, we're good, trust me. That's not how it should work. It is not how it should work. So even though Beth Clarkson lost in every case and in every appeal when she sued, because again, I followed the advice of my attorneys, which was good, solid legal advice, okay? She brought the attention to the matter that we did not have post-election audits in Kansas, and we did not have that verification. And I do not believe that we would now have post-election audits in Kansas if Ms. Clarkson had not been so consistent with her messaging, with her concerns, with bringing up the fact, and did I enjoy it? Absolutely not. I did not enjoy that one bit. Not one moment of being sued, of being vilified, of getting hate mail, of those things did I enjoy? No. But now looking back, our election system is so much stronger and so much better because of what she did that I absolutely understand why she did it. And I think she doesn't really get the credit, but she should get credit for the fact that we have a 2020 election that has been challenged all across the country. And in Kansas, we conducted post-election audits, and we know that our machines accurately counted our ballots because of the work that Beth Clarkson did.
Well, what can election officials do to avoid these needlessly adversarial relationships?
Well, for me, it was just coming to that realization, and it really didn't happen until the last several years of being in office, that advocacy groups are not necessarily the enemy. We may not agree all the time on who should be allowed to vote or how they should be allowed to vote, but in the end, both hearts should be in the same place, and that is making sure that the process of voting is as secure and accessible as possible. And again, continuing to talk about those two that really pull and push against each other, and finding that balance is difficult. But honestly, for me, the most freeing thing was realizing the other political party, meaning the Democratic Party, the advocacy groups, they were not publicly enemy number one to me. And in fact, I could create and foster a good, healthy working relationship with them while still abiding by the laws and making sure that I did the election as I'm required to do. There was nothing holding me back from doing that. And once I had that aha moment, so I will give a shout out. I credit Doug Chapin who was my professor who gave me that aha moment. But that it was very freeing, first of all, when lawsuits were filed or open records requests were filed, instead of viewing it as they're out to get me, viewing it as they're out to help build this process to be much bigger and better and more robust. And then it became freeing. It was give them the open records. This is not something, if they find something we did wrong, great, let's learn from it and let's improve and let's fix what we did wrong. And that completely changed my entire, first of all, you're not living in fear of every open records request that you've got. And secondly, just acknowledging. There were times when I would give information to people and say, hey, if you find something that we did wrong, please let me know, because I need to know so that we can fix this in the future. And coming from that perspective, instead of it being this adversarial, I'm only going to give you if I'm required to by a court of law, to our elections need to be open and transparent, even if it leads to me being sued, because that's how the process works. And this is how these are the checks and balances that our Constitution has in place for us. And that is very freeing once you reach that point. It takes a lot. But once you get there, it's very freeing.
Did you have any thoughts about the supposed gutting of the NVRA?
We were not really covered by the Voting Rights Act in Kansas, and so I had not. Official,
did you have any thoughts about it? I recall, leading up to the 2020 election, reading article after article about this is going to be the first election in a long time without the full protections of the NVRA. And just as an expert, I was just curious about, what your thoughts were about it.
I would say because, this is where I'm going to fall back on my expertise, is because I was not in a jurisdiction or an area that was covered by that. I did not really understand the full impacts of that because there were sections of it that did not apply to Sedgwick County. And quite frankly, when you don't have resources and you don't have staff, you focus on the areas where you have to know. And that wasn't my area of expertise. I think that this leads me to another one where I think there's an unfair vilification, both on the side of advocacy groups and sometimes the Democratic Party, and that is like when a polling place changes, that was a purposeful move on the part of an election official. And I will advocate this, and I know that was covered under NVRA, and I apologize for doing this out of order from when we were having that conversation, but this is when it's coming to my mind. And I know in some jurisdictions they couldn't change a polling place without it going through up the chain and through Department of Justice for approval, that sort of thing. But election officials do not like changing polling places. It is an extreme amount of work. You have to go through, I think it's a 28-page document, maybe more, from the Department of Justice on ADA accessibility. If it's not accessible, you have to go through and make temporary measures to make it accessible. You have to notify all the voters it's changed. You have to reconfigure your floor plan of how it's to make it to where everything's accessible, but no one can see the screen of voting machine. All those things. It's very difficult and it's very time consuming. And then you get all the calls from the angry voters who don't want to move to different polling places. It is something that in our world is to be avoided at all costs, but it happens. We can't always control that. And there are many reasons why it happens. It may happen because the polling place itself will no longer be available to us. We're sitting here in the Wichita Advanced Learning Library right now doing this interview, and they were a polling place for us, and they've shuttered their doors and no longer allowed the election office to use this as a polling place. That was not the election office decision. That was a decision of the library board, I believe, or the library itself due to COVID, not allowing large crowds in, that sort of thing. But it has not opened back up, to my knowledge. I'm no longer the election official, so I could be wrong. There are things that happen that are beyond our control. We had a whole situation with petitions being circulated at polling places, and looking at the laws, my attorneys and myself determined that as long as there was specific guidelines followed, petitions could be circulated outside of a polling location. That caused us to lose some polling locations. And then you just have something like shortly before the primary election of this year, we had, when I was still the election official, a church just folded. And so they were no longer available to be a polling place. Now, in that situation, that area, there is no other place to have a polling place. And that is a large number of voters assigned to that polling place. And we have spent years trying to find another polling place and could not find it. Thankfully, the new church that bought the building was willing to be a polling place, and it continued just under a different name. There are so many reasons why it happens that it becomes very much vilified when a polling place is changed and is viewed as a effort to disenfranchise voters, when it absolutely is not. And in a lot of times, in my time as election commissioner, we added, I think, 20 polling locations to Sedgwick County because we had more voters. We didn't have enough polling places, and we would get pushback from voters when we divided a polling place. We weren't trying to make them drive further or something like that. We were literally trying to have fewer voters assigned to a polling place so they did not have to stand in line. And we would get so much pushback from people who were angry, and they'd be like, well, before I was 3 blocks away from my polling place and now I'm a mile. Well, I'm sorry, but somebody's going to be a mile away. I can't do that. There's no way to always find a polling place in the middle of every precinct. It's not going to happen.
Is that where the idea of being able to vote anywhere in the county came from?
It is. It is part of that.
Can you talk about that?
That, and we just saw a...
Can you talk about that as an innovation?
Sure, yeah. There was a lot of provisional ballots in Sedgwick County, and there still are, from people who just decide they're going to go wherever they want to go to vote. And I think that's partially because of convenience, and they just see an I voted banner and they're going to go and they're going to vote. But it's also because we have a very robust early voting program in Sedgwick County. And when I left, I think we were up to 18. 19 early voting centers that we had in 2020. And the purpose of that was so that we could provide early voting as close to people's homes or business as we could, make it as convenient for them to vote, but still they can vote in person if that's what they wanted to do. It reduces that congestion at polling places on election day. And when we struggle to get enough election workers, that's a very key component, because you have people who are election workers who are willing to work election day. They're also willing to work early voting. But when you can't get enough people who are just willing to work election day, you have to do something to pull those lines off of election day. So that's where balloting by mail and early in-person voting comes. But we had a lot of people in Sedgwick County who would just vote provisionally because they went to the wrong polling location. So that was the first thing that started working well. Why not incorporate that concept then onto election day as well, to just make it more user-friendly? It was not something that I just did lightly. You know, I drove to Texas, my chief deputy and I drove to Texas and observed an election there where they did vote centers. We listened to them. You know, one of the things that I had thought was, we're going to start opening vote centers in like where the voters are. We'll go to Town East and Town West. We'll just do, and this seemed like a grand idea. And when we were in Texas, they're like, do not do that. And I was like, why? And they said, because they have vote centers in grocery stores and people will be grocery shopping and they will stand in a 2-hour-long line to vote instead of getting in their car and going down the road and walking and voting and walking out, because they're already physically there. But the 2-hour-long line is the national headline. It's not that there were 20 other vote centers in that county that had absolutely no line, that had virtually no voters show up that day. There was opportunity. It's that when you put it where the people are, then unless you can put it like an interest bank arena where you can put in like 40, 50 machines and not worry about it, you end up with these long lines. And so those are things you learn from talking to other people
You've got me
who've done
thinking
it.
about lots of stuff now. So, like, how do you feel, for instance, about early voting? You know, that extended period of early voting, or off hour and Saturday voting, and then lastly, can you kind of lift the veil on this idea of purging?
Oh, sure. That is a definite one. I'll start with the early voting. Obviously, I'm passionate about early voting, whether it's ballots by mail or early in person. It is something that I think makes it much easier for people, makes it much more accessible. And when we talk about the tension between accessible and security, to me, balloting by mail and early voting in person are ways that we can securely relieve some of that tension on election day. And I know I even have discussions, some of them rather passionately, with some of my own family members about they feel it should strictly be election day. My husband prefers to vote on election day, not from a policy perspective, but just this is election day and that's when he votes. I did break him of that. I did. But poor man. Anyway, he didn't get to miss any elections because you haven't voted. My children as well. I have even publicly shamed my children on social media. Be like, I've noticed it's the last day of early voting and so-and-so has not voted yet. And I'm like, yes, my poor son made it into national news because I did that to him. And it was actually just kind of a funny thing to do. Didn't realize it would get as much traction as it did. But back to your subject. There is, and this is where I struggle, like with HR 1 and Senate Bill 1 that were defeated, and now we have new bills coming up. I struggle with some of the content in that because it is a one-size-fits-all. It's everyone must do it this way. And the truth of the matter is what Sedgwick County voters need and demand, and what Wichita County voters, which voters tend to think Wichita County is Wichita. It is not. The poor Wichita County clerk constantly was sending me voter registration cards and advanced applications from people thinking, anyway, side note, but what Wichita County voters need and what Sedgwick County voters need are vastly, vastly different things. So when we start mandating that you must have X number of days of early voting, and it must be after hours, and it must be on Saturdays and Sundays, and it must be all of these things, when you have a jurisdiction that only has a couple thousand registered voters, that really doesn't fit for them, because why would they need that? They already have it available at their courthouse or maybe another location. They can vote by mail. So I struggle with this. I firmly believe jurisdictions like Sedgwick County, it is absolutely vital. They must have it. And I know there's a conversation about, does that then give people unequal access? And that is something that is a struggle, and I haven't quite figured out how that balances. But I do know that when you have something that costs a tremendous amount of money and nobody takes advantage of it, it becomes a mandate that is virtually useless. And I don't mean to be flippant about it, but I struggle with that. So if I just talk about Sedgwick County alone, okay, early voting is a huge component of voting in Sedgwick County, and it was before me and it was during my time. It is very important to offer that because people may go out of town, they may get sick, especially when you had things like coronavirus. We had some polling places that required masks, and while we were not going to dictate that voters had to wear a mask because we did not have the constitutional authority to say you were going to be denied the right to vote unless you wore a mask. You see what I'm saying? The polling place itself may require a mask. Someone may not feel comfortable with that. We had changes in election gun laws in, I think, 2014. And it took out, Kansas law used to say that you could not carry a firearm into a polling place, and it took that out of the law. Well, so then we had voters who were very concerned about going into a polling place, and they were on both sides. We had people who refused to go to a polling place if they did not get to carry the gun. We had people who refused to go to a polling place if they allowed people to carry their gun.
Just to be clear, you don't need a gun to vote, though, do you?
You don't, no. I've never seen a situation where you needed a gun to vote. No.
Just to be clear.
We work very hard. We have always worked very hard in Sedgwick County. I think we have a long before me and before my predecessor and before that person, a long history of making voting as accessible as we could in Sedgwick County. I don't think you need a gun to vote. But either way, no matter where you feel on gun rights, we had people on both sides. We lost polling places because they did not want the public to carry guns in. And so having an available option for early voting so that they did not have to go to their polling place if it allowed concealed carry or if it did not allow it, no matter which direction the person was, because we could not find polling places that were all the same, nor would we make everyone happy if we did. I had a neighbor who our home polling place was a machinist union. He was adamantly against unions and would, every time he had to vote, every time we had a community meeting, he would get in my face about, you're making me vote in a union hall. I'm like, no, I'm not. You can vote by mail and you can vote early anywhere you want. I am not making you vote anywhere, man. But there's, there are things like that, and it's all sides. It's all sides. One of the things people just do not understand, they do not understand unless you have been a local election official. And I would argue even at the state level, it's not fully understood. Until you are a local election official, you cannot possibly understand the amount of pressure that these local officials are under from all sides. If they are elected, they are under tremendous pressure from their party. If they are appointed by an elected official, they are under tremendous pressure from that person or that political party. And they are under pressure from the advocacy groups, from the voters, from polling places, from all of these ways. And they're asked to take a stance on a law that they may not be comfortable taking a stance on, not because they don't have a personal belief, but if they take a stance on that law, it may affect their ability to get reelected. There are so many things, so many pressures that election officials face, and now since 2020, it really started in 2016, but rolling into 2020 and post-2020, we have introduced this, it seems to be okay to send them absolutely vicious, nasty hate mail, threatening their existence. I spent 5 days in Maricopa County, Arizona recently, and hearing from the election officials there what they have gone through is absolutely horrifying. It made me cry. I mean, there was no other way to explain it and no other way for me to respond. It was horrific. I can't believe any of them are still there. I don't know why they're still there.
That was the place with the bamboo ballot.
Yes. And the report has still not come out from Cyber Ninjas on that. There's this concept that we don't trust a process because we can't trust the vendors, we can't trust the election officials, we can't trust all of these people. But the thing that I struggle to get people to understand is at all steps of the process, there's not one political party running things. The vendors have all kinds of political parties inside of them in their organizations. The election offices have all kinds of political parties involved. We are required to do testing of every piece of voting equipment before it is used to make sure it is accurately counting the votes. We then test again 5 days before the election in a public testing to prove that the ballots counted are being counted accurately. We then test post-elections to make sure the machines are still working. We have post-election audits. We have political party balances. I worked very hard to make sure my chief deputy was a Democrat because I was a Republican and because she was damn good at her job, okay? And she kept me sane from losing my mind.
Well, talk about the purges.
Yes, I'm sorry. I went way, I think I answered those other questions, but this is me, sorry. So, yeah, we are required actually by federal and state law to do purges. I don't like to call them purges because that comes with a very negative connotation, just like voting a provisional ballot does. The purpose of the NVRA and subsequent laws in Kansas and in other states is that you need to make sure that your voter rolls are as clean as possible. And when I say as clean as possible, that there will always be inaccuracies on the voting rolls because the impetus is on the voter to keep their data, keep our databases as up to date as possible. However, we do, both NVRA and Kansas law require that election officials run their database past the national change of address, which is with the post office, at least once a year. In Sedgwick County, we did it more than once, and just because we had the availability of, we purchased software to do that. But requiring it once a year to say if you've moved, let's say you moved from, I don't know where you live, but let's say you lived in Sedgwick County and you moved to Butler County, and I get this notification from the post office saying you filed a change of address with the post office, then I would then send something to you called a confirmation card to the Butler County address and say, hey, our records show you no longer live in Sedgwick County. If you sign that and return that to us, it removes you from being registered in Sedgwick County, but it does not register you to vote in Butler County. That is something most people don't realize. They think if I sign this, now I'm registered here. It does not move you to that other county. It just simply cancels the previous county. But if you don't sign that, then you go into an inactive status, where we continue to reach out to you intermittently, depending upon if we get more notifications from the post office, or if we have a polling place change notice, we go ahead and send it to the address where you were registered to vote. It'll bounce back if you're no longer there, okay? You are given then 2 federal election cycles to either vote or update your voter registration. If you have no activity, and when I say 2 federal election cycles, that means gubernatorial to presidential, because you have Senate and House on, federal offices on the gubernatorial ballot. So it's basically, depending upon when you go on, it could be 2 to 4 years time frame to either cast a ballot in any election, not just federal election, state, local, any election, or update your registration with us. If you do not at that point, then you're removed from the voter rolls. So it is not like we just say, hey, I don't like this person, I'm gonna take them off the rolls today. There are very strict laws about when an election official can remove someone. So strict, in fact, that, and I'll tell you an anecdotal story where it's not anecdotal, it's a true story. As an election official, one of the first emails I got was a frustrated email from a voter who someone had stolen his daughter's identity and created a new name. And through a process of doing something else, I believe it was actually getting state assistance under this fraudulent name, they had registered to vote. So this person did not exist. So under all the laws that protect voters from an election official just being able to remove them, I could not remove that person from the voter rolls because they had not deceased, they had not been convicted of a felony, they had not requested to be removed. They had not moved out of the jurisdiction because they never lived here to start with. And we went through all of those scenarios and we could not remove them. I went with Secretary of State's attorneys. We could not come up with a scenario to remove this person. Why voter IDs are important, first of all, okay? Prove that that person never voted, never attempted to vote because they did not exist. But they were frustrated because they were on the voter rolls. So they could not even go to the post office and fill out a change of address for the person because they weren't the person. That person didn't exist.
But let me ask you this. So, look, and this is my last question, probably almost out of tape, but tape, I'm like really dating myself.
Yeah, I just wanted to speed past that.
This is the last question. What would you say to African Americans in particular who feel as though there are concerted efforts to suppress their vote? And this is sort of, I'm asking you to talk nationally.
Okay, not locally.
Not in terms of Kansas, but places like Philadelphia and Atlanta, the way they voted and the way those votes carried the new president into office, and then to have a new wave of legislation aimed seemingly at suppressing the vote. What would you say to African American voters who are like, there seems to be this concerted effort, against us voting? What can we do?
Well, first of all, I would like to say, first of all, I have not met an election official, and I am very much involved, still am, at the national level, at across the country. I have not met a single one who I honestly believed was trying to suppress anyone's vote. I have met many policymakers who have flat out acknowledged to me they are seeking to suppress certain people's votes. And believe it or not, Kobach was not one of them. Just would like to throw that one out there because I knew that's where everyone's mind was going to be. I never once heard Kobach say, I don't want this demographic of people to vote. That was never part of his process. Anyway, I just know that's something he gets criticized for, and I'm just going to throw that out there. But I have heard many legislators and many policymakers say they want to, whether it's Kansas or nationally, to African Americans or other marginalized groups, I would say your best weapon is get involved. And most people think when I say that, I mean, yes, vote, obviously, vote, fight for your right to vote, always vote. I'm going to say that to every single person I meet, no matter what, vote, every single election. But when I say get involved, I mean work a polling place. Volunteer or get hired in to work at your county or local election office. Understand the inner workings. If you find something corrupt, scream it from the hilltops. But I'm going to tell you 9 times out of 10, the county election official is not going to be the person who's your problem. They may have to follow laws that they do not agree with, but they're not going to be your problem. Get involved so you understand the electoral process, so that you can speak with authority. But additionally, take that a step further. Run for office. Get involved in redistricting processes. We have redistricting going on right now. I'm involved with the League of Women Voters with helping with people-powered maps. And I'm not speaking as, I don't want to misconstrue, I'm not speaking as that, but that is a way I've kept myself involved in the election process, is getting engaged with advocacy groups who, in years past, I viewed almost as publicly enemy number 1 for me. And now I'm friends, and now we understand we're all working towards that same goal. Whether we go about it the same way or even agree, we're working towards the same goal. So get involved, but most definitely do not ever let your voice be silenced. Do so, obviously, in legal manners. But for me, I was raised in a very sheltered environment. I was homeschooled. My dad was a Baptist preacher, okay? So I did not see a lot of what was going on in the world around me. And that's not a criticism of my parents. I don't want that to come off that way. That was the bubble I was raised in. When I started going to national election official conferences and started actually taking classes from the Election Center and Auburn University and actually learned about voter rights and the fights. And the most eye-opening thing for me, I think it was in 2014, I was at a class and they were talking about something that had occurred actually in 2008. And a jurisdiction where they had not provided enough voting equipment, not enough ballots. These voters were lined up for hours, calling the election office, begging for, and this was not in Kansas, so I want to be very clear about that, begging for more voting equipment, begging for more things, and the election office was not answering, not bringing things out there, but yet other parts of the jurisdiction, everything was running very smoothly, but in African American neighborhoods, it was not. And then you had the white mayor walk into this library, and she and I watched the video of it, just very condescendingly made some comment about, well, look at this great turnout. Let's not talk about the fact that we don't have enough voting equipment. Let's not talk about the failings of the election officials here. Good on you for showing up. And hey, why don't you avail yourself of all of these books and you can learn while you're in line? And I mean, my heart just stopped. It was an eye-opening moment of, we have a problem that I didn't know about. And we have to talk about this and we have to take action. And that was one of the turning points in my career of making sure that if I had to move a polling place, I made sure it was on a bus route or it was on that it was accessible to voters who may be marginalized in any way. But I think, just to come back to it, make sure that your voice is heard. Don't give up. I have unfortunately seen way too much racism. And of course, it's not at me, but I see it. I have experienced it as an election official where we had a voter one time in 2012 refused to state their name and address when the voter ID law and give their ID to an African-American poll worker. And I was called into that situation and explained to the voter that their option was to not vote provisionally, or give it, and they wanted me to just basically have that person step aside and work the check-in table for them. And I hope I did not make that person uncomfortable, but of course your thought is, oh hell no. You can follow the rules and you can give this African American poll worker your information, or that's your problem. That's no longer mine. But I also had another situation where we had a woman who was working the polls, one of our best election workers, but she wore a habib. And I had a voter who called and was just livid, screaming and yelling as though we'd hired a terrorist to work the polling locations. That was in the last couple of years. When you still see those things going on, you cannot bury your head in the sand and act like this is not a problem. I don't care. You're a human being. It should not matter. It should not matter. It should not matter. I can't even say that enough. But for people that unfortunately it does matter for, don't stop fighting.
Good.
Yeah, I think
I'm
we're
sure I gave you way more information than